Good afternoon, everyone. For those now in Europe, welcome. There's still people joining, but since there's a lot of content, many things that are going to happen in this 2-hour session, we're going to kickstart it. So welcome everybody to another Data Europa Academy event. As you may know me, my name is Ima Farfan Velasco, and I work for the Publications Office of the European Union, managing the European Data Portal. This is a very special event we're organizing. It's a 3-part training series, visualizing data with impact, where we will learn on data visualization and how to turn complex data into clear, ethical, and engaging visuals. It's a 3-day event that is allocated for 1 hour and a half initially, but our speaker will stay until 6:30 in case of questions. So we really recommend you to come to all these three day events, since each episode build up from the last one to really master the principle of ethical and impactful data visualization. So today is the first episode, Foundations of Effective Data Visualization, and I have here with me one excellence of data visualization, Alberto Cairo. Thank you so much, Alberto Cairo. He's a
Thank
ninth
you.
chair visual journalism from the University of Miami. He's a leading expert in data visualization and information design, and he is author of several very influential books on the world of data, storytelling, and design. So just to reply to your question, because I saw already this question in the chat, yes, all these training sessions will be recorded and published on the Data Europa Academy. And also, Alberto was very kind that he also prepares supporting material for you all to keep learning on this specific aspect. I'm not going to take more time, so I would like to thank so much, Alberto, for your time. We very much look forward to these 3-day episodes, and yes, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. And I would like to thank you and the rest of the team at Data Europa Academy for having me, and also thank you everyone for attending this first webinar. Out of 3. So without further ado, I'm going to just begin talking about the contents of the class today. But before I proceed, I would like to begin by quoting a famous Czech philosopher, Jan Patočka, who in a book that collects some of his lectures, which was published in 1991, entitled Plato and Europe, he says at the very beginning, "I should ask, please, that you do not take what I say as something definite or final, but rather as a conversation among friends." And this is how I approach all my classes. It's actually how I approach all my classes, how I approach all my writings, how I approach also all the books that I have written so far, as a conversation among friends, as a conversation between peers. Today, I am inviting you to my home. This is my home. I am right now in my home office, my little corner. I'm surrounded by some of my books here on the left-hand side, my board games. I am a fan of tabletop strategy and war games behind it. So I'm inviting you to my place because I am assuming that we are in a community of peers, but also in a community of friends. And it is in this spirit that you should take everything that I'm about to say, which is nothing definite or final. It's just the opinions and the takes of someone who has been working in the field of information design more broadly and more specifically data visualization for nearly 30 years. This is my intention today and in the following days to share with you a little bit of what I have learned in these 3 decades. So what is information design? We can begin with that. So information design is essentially the presentation of information to allow people to understand that information. Right? That's essentially what it is. And this is a broad field that encompasses a lot of different branches, from the design of signs that you can see on the streets or on airports, to web design, to document design. And one of the branches of information design is the branch that I specialize on, which is information graphics, graphics that convey information to people, and more specifically, data visualization, which is that branch of information design that consists of the graphical encoding and presentation of data to facilitate a understanding. So I would like to begin with a little bit about me, telling you a little bit of where I'm coming from and about my career, because it puts in context all the teachings that I'm about to deliver to you in these 3 days, and also give you a little bit of housekeeping later on. So as Inma said, I am a professor at the University of Miami in the United States. But before I became a professor, this was back in 2005, I also worked in the news industry as an information designer, as someone who created maps, charts, graphs, diagrams, visual explanations, 3D models, animations to explain information to readers. On the screen right now, you have images and screenshots of several information graphics that I have designed throughout my career. And some of these will return throughout these 3 webinars because I will refer to them to exemplify some of the principles of information design that I will be explaining. I began my career in Spain. I'm originally from Spain, therefore the accent that I have here. I was born in northwestern Spain, moved to Madrid to become the graphics director of El Mundo, which is the second newspaper in Spain, the online operation of the newspaper El Mundo. I moved to the United States. I also lived in Brazil. The graphic that you have on the right-hand side is one of the graphics that I designed when I was in Brazil. I was the graphics director of the magazines of Editora Globo. Globo is the largest group of communication in Latin America, and I was in charge of the graphics for all the magazines of the group. But I've also tried to, throughout my career, I have tried to pair my professional interests, designing things, which I still keep doing. I still keep designing graphics this day with the teaching of the principles that underlie the graphics that you have on the screens right now. So back in 2005, I became a professor in the United States, originally in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in the United States. And beginning in 2012, I became a professor at the University of Miami in Florida. And before I forget, by the way, as Inma was saying, these sessions are going to be recorded, but the slide decks that I'm using are also going to be made public to you, so you will all have access to the images that I'm presenting, which contain links to different resources, or in this case, a link to my professional profile at the University of Miami and some of the projects that I have been delivering. I also do a lot of consulting, training, art direction. So besides teaching the craft, I also keep practicing the craft. I have an ongoing relationship with Google, professional relationship, and later on, perhaps on day 3 of these webinars, I will show you a couple of projects that I have created for Google. I've worked for the World Bank, worked for the Congressional Budget Office in the United States. Very recently, I finished a series of data-driven stories for the Publications Office of the European Union, which I will also refer to. So I will expose you to my professional work. And as Inma was saying, I'm also the author of several books about data visualization. My writing career began in 2012, and I've been writing books up to this date. My most recent one is the Art of Insight, which was published in 2023. And I'm currently working on a new one that hopefully will be published around 2027, that will capture perhaps some of the principles that I will be outlining for you here today. So let's begin with some housekeeping about these webinars, just to show you what it is that you're going to be seeing. Today we are on day 1. That's today's webinar, October the 14th. Tomorrow at the same time, that's going to be episode 2, in which I will focus a little bit more on the ethics of data visualization. But I will also talk a little bit about visual design and structuring visualizations. And then episode 3, which is going to be on October the 16th, I will focus much more on the visual design aspects of data visualization. And this is the outline. I'm not going to read all these, obviously. It's a lot of text. I'm just leaving here for you to take a look at and get a sense of what it is that you're going to be witnessing. This is not a table of contents, by the way. This is just a list of the themes that I will be touching upon on each one of the webinars. So for example, today I will be focusing on an introduction to data visualization. I will talk a little bit about why we visualize in the first place. I will also expose you to what we call in visualization the grammar of graphics. And then finally, I will focus on what I believe that there are really no rules in visualization design. All that we can aim for is to create a decision-making framework, a decision-making process that can lead us to creating more effective data visualizations. As Inma was saying, this is going to take around 1 hour and something, and then we will have at the end plenty of time to answer any questions that you may have after my presentation today. Anyway, so let's get started. Let's get into it. So one core idea in everything that I have done up to this date is that one of the core beliefs, right, that I have developed throughout my career is that everybody can design. The same way that everybody can write, can learn how to write, everybody can learn how to design well. And this is highly beneficial. It's extremely beneficial, learning how to design well. Not only data visualizations, but more broadly, any other type of design. There are many reasons why I believe this. One of them is the following. Years ago, I read a book by the way, before I forget, this is just an aside. I love recommending books. You can see a pile of books over here. These are all books about data visualization. I will refer to some of them throughout the webinars. I'm going to start recommending books to you. First one is this book by famous cartographer Mark Monmonier, Mapping It Out, Expository Cartography for the Humanities and the Social Sciences. In this book, Monmonier says that today our idea or concept, our modern concept of what literacy is, should be much broader than the traditional notion of literacy, right? The traditional notion of literacy is the notion that we should all learn how to read and write. Obviously, that's traditional literacy. But Monmonier says that today, in modern democratic societies, literacy should encompass much more than merely being able to read and write. He also says that we should develop also a sense of how to express our ideas verbally, and he calls this articulacy. And on top of that, he also says, well, we should all develop, or we should teach in our educational systems, a sense of how to think about science and how to think about numbers, about data. And we call this numeracy. There's a specific term to refer to that. And as a complement, a supplement to these different literacies that we should master to become, working citizens in democratic republics, he also says that we should all develop a sense of graphicacy, which is graphical literacy. And that's exactly what my classes are about and my books are about. It's about spreading knowledge of graphicacy. Whenever I teach classes at the University of Miami, one of the things that I tell my students is that I will not teach them how to design graphics. That will be just a byproduct of the class. What I truly teach is about how to think about graphics, how to think about those visual displays of information, maps, diagrams, charts, etc., to reason about them and to reason with them. That's what graphicacy is about. And by developing this sense of graphicacy, a byproduct of that is that we also become better designers of graphics. And believe me, anybody and everybody can learn, given that we absorb certain principles and we apply them, and given that we are willing to put some time and effort, obviously, in developing this graphical sense. The idea that everybody can design or everybody can learn how to design well, I have the proof that this is true every single semester. What you have on the screen right now are two posters full of data visualizations designed by two former data science students of mine who had no experience whatsoever in data visualization at the beginning of the semester in my classes. And a couple of months later, after they, sign up for my class, the semester began, I started teaching and they started developing their projects. A month and a half, 2 months later, they were able to design beautiful posters like the ones that you have on the screen. That, I believe, in my opinion, shows that, again, everybody can learn, anybody can learn. And it also shows that design and data visualization, more in particular, is not magic, right? There's nothing magical about it. Although sometimes when we see great data visualizations, think about, for example, I don't know, the graphics that we all can see in the New York Times or in El País in Spain and many other media publications, they look so intricate and beautiful and so well designed that leads many people to believe, well, there's something that is out of reach for me to create these graphics. And that is not true. Given that we apply some principles that I will outline for you today and in days to come, and that we are willing to put the effort, all of us can learn to design graphics such as these ones or these ones. These also were designed by former students of mine, students of engineering and students of biology. Again, they were able to create graphics like these just a couple of months into the semester. But as I said before, this requires some effort. It is not enough just to listen to me presenting these principles to you. It is also necessary that after you attend these webinars, you actually get your hands dirty and start applying these principles on a regular basis to your daily work. Because data visualization, it has a scientific component, but at the end, data visualization and more broadly, information design, they are crafts. And like writing, they are crafts. And in order to learn how to engage in a craft effectively, we need to practice it. Every semester, I get feedback from my students, and sometimes these feedback can be greatly illuminating. I'm going to share with you a screenshot, a portion of an email that I received from a former student of mine a couple of semesters ago. He said, Dr. Cairo, I really enjoyed this class. I wanted to pull my hair out many times, and this is because I give my students tons of work to do every semester. Again, this is a craft. If you don't practice it, you're not going to learn it. But here comes the most important part of his email. It has completely changed the way that I think about charts and design. Because again, my classes are not about how to become better designers. They are about how to become better thinkers about data visualization and with data visualization. And as a byproduct of that, we can also become better designers of data. So that is the key sentence, that essentially the key idea that drives these 3 webinars: to change your mind, to change the way that you think about charts, about maps, about graphs, about visual design, about information design, and data visualization. But here comes a caveat or a warning. And this is also something that I warn my students about. Even if I'm going to talk to you about principles of visualization, etc., you should always remember that whenever I speak, remember what the words of Jan Patočka at the very beginning, the conversation among friends, there is nothing definitive here, right? These are just the opinions of someone who has a lot of experience in this field, but at the end, they are just my opinions. So what I'm going to expose to you here today and in days to come is not to how to make data visualization. There are many ways to produce data visualizations. What I'm going to expose to you is how I, an individual designer, makes data visualizations, the reasons that I give myself to produce data visualizations in a very specific way, my way of doing, my way of making data visualizations. So that's about the introduction, all about the introduction. Let's get into the actual content of the webinar. Let's begin with the basics. Let's begin with the bare basics of what data visualization is about, or the way that I understand what visualization is truly about. To me, or the way that I think about visualization, is that visualization is a way or a tool for exploration, discovery, reasoning, and also communication, right? Visualization has this intrinsic multiplicity to it. Sometimes we design visualizations because we need to understand a piece of information better, right? If you are analyzing a big data set, you may need to visualize that data set in order to understand what patterns and trends may hide within that data set. Or sometimes if you're trying to understand a piece of information, so for example, if you're reading a very complex book, it can be extremely useful to create a diagram of the main concepts of that book. This is a technique actually that my father taught me when I was a teenager. He said, whenever you read a book, don't just read it. Always have sort of like a piece of paper next to you and start writing down the concepts that appear in the book, and then draw arrows connecting those concepts, because through that diagram that you are creating, you're going to be able to understand this book better. And not only that, but later on, years later, when you have already completely forgotten the content of that book, you can go back to that diagram, take a look at that diagram, and you will immediately remember what the book was about. So visualization can also be a tool to improve memorability, to increase your memory. So visualization has this multiplicity to it. Obviously, as a journalist, as a data journalist, I tend to use visualization mainly for communication, right? I have an idea, I want to communicate it to you, and I do it through diagrams, charts, maps, and other types of visual displays. Now, regardless of the purpose, right, regardless of what we use visualization for, there are some basic concepts that underlie all visualizations in the world. And the one of them is the idea that visualization works because it is grounded, or is intrinsically connected to the way that our vision works, our visual perception and our visual cognition. Our visual perception evolved through evolution by natural selection to detect patterns in the world. This is a very simple example. Imagine that I show you a wall made of bricks, and all these bricks have exactly the same properties, the same attribute, same color, same size, same shape, same everything. You don't even need to think about it. Your brain immediately detects a pattern. The pattern that you're detecting is they all look the same. This is pre-conscious, it's pre-attentive. You don't even need to think about it. Your brain immediately knows, oh, they are all the same, right? We call this pre-attentive processing in visual perception and cognition. However, if I make any change, if I change any of these bricks that you have in front of you, if I change the size, the color, the shape, or any other type of attribute of any of those bricks, your brain will get immediately directed to that brick that is different to the other, to the exception to the pattern. This interplay between patterns and exceptions to the patterns, that is one of the core ideas behind data visualization. Data visualization is about many things, but one of the core things it is about displaying patterns and the exceptions to those patterns. We're going to return to this theme over and over again throughout the day today and in days to come. Very importantly, though, as 99% of what I have to say to you here, 99% that I have written in my books, 99% of what I teach in my classes, this is not an original idea. And I love to give credit to the people I borrow ideas from. I borrow this idea, or this core notion that visualization is about detecting patterns and exceptions to those patterns. I borrowed it from John Tukey. John Tukey he passed years ago. John Tukey was a famous statistician who back in the 60s and the 70s wrote a series of groundbreaking papers and a groundbreaking book titled Exploratory Data Analysis, in which he revealed himself as a great advocate for the use of data visualization in statistical analysis, right? This relationship between patterns and the exceptions to those patterns underlies what this book is about. One of the things that Tukey wrote about in his papers and in his book is that the greatest value of transforming information into images is that by doing so, we may be able to see realities that we otherwise would not be able to notice, right? The way that I usually explain this to my students is that a visualization, in some sense, is a tool for understanding. It's a tool to expand our perception and our cognition. There's a whole reason, by the way, that my first book was titled, or is titled, The Functional Art. Because in the way that I see visualization, to me, visualization is an art that has a function, a purpose. It's a tool, right? I usually make a lot of analogies in my classes. I usually explain to students, a visualization is like the pair of glasses that I'm wearing right now, right? If I take them off, my vision becomes very blurry. I barely see anything. I need to move close to my screen to read Tukey's words on my screen. But suddenly, if I put these on, right, suddenly my vision becomes sharper. I'm able to see the patterns in the world much more clearly than I did before. This is the way that I envision visualization. Visualization is a way to see clearer, to see beyond, to see more, to see better, to see deeper. And by seeing deeper, better, etc., we will also be able to reason deeper about those realities that visualization may be revealing to us. Obviously, thinking about visualization in terms of being a tool for exploration, understanding, communication has a lot of consequences and a lot of implications. Again, the functional art. Visualization is a tool, and therefore, to me, it is a tool. So in order to design visualizations, we need to think a little bit about engineers. We need to think about visualization in terms of the properties that it has, in terms of how well the content of the visualization is connected to the way that we present the information, and so on and so forth. We will return to all these ideas much later. The connection between, purpose and function, function and content, and so on and so forth. But let me show you let's begin with an example, right? Before I get deeper into all these ideas, let me show you an example about the power of visualization to reveal patterns and trends in data. And it's also a great way to explain, whenever we are going to present data to other people, of when to use a numerical table and when to use a visualization. Because numerical tables can also be great ways to present data to people. It all depends on what the purpose of the presentation may be. Let me begin by showing you a table. This is a numerical table, right? Your classical Excel spreadsheet with tons of numbers, tons of figures, right? So it is a database. This is a very famous data set, by the way, created in the late 1990s, of average global temperatures between the year 1000 and the year 2000, right? So it's a data set related to global warming and climate change. Column A is the year. Obviously, I'm not seeing you the entire database, right? It's just a couple of screenshots. So first column A, those are the years. Column B is the actual temperatures. And you can see, by the way, I need to make an aside here. You can see that there are temperatures there that are negative, right? And this is in Celsius degrees. And you may be wondering, how is it possible that the average temperature of the world was negative 0.1 Celsius degrees? That's not possible, right? The world would have been an ice ball, right? Well, the reason why we have negative values there is that when climate scientists want to present data to the public, particularly data about climate change and global warming, they usually don't inform us of the actual temperature for every year. They index all those values to a zero baseline. The zero baseline is usually the average temperature between the year 1961 and 1980, right? They average the temperature of those years. And then what they present to us is whether the temperature of a particular year was above that average or below that average, right? So the negative values that you see there mean below the average of the 20th century, or the middle of the 20th century, or above the average of the middle of the 20th century. This is a necessary aside, just to explain what the data is about. In any case, you have all this data set, and as the presenter of the data to you, I'm going to ask you, do you think that this is valuable? Do you see anything interesting here? Anything that catches your attention, right? Well, the answer to that question will greatly depend on what you want to extract from the data. Let's imagine, for example, that as a reader, your goal when reading this data set is to be able to see or to identify the specific values that correspond to every year, right? You want to see what the average temperature of the world was in 1881. Well, The table is fantastic for that, right? You can just navigate to 1881, which happens to be row 883, and then you can see that the temperature was minus 0.1977. Great, I accomplished my goal. That's what tables are about, right? That's what tables are for. Whenever the purpose of a visual display is that a reader will be able to identify specific values in the data set, nothing beats a table, right? The data should be presented as a table. But what about if the purpose were different? Again, going back to Tukey's words, what about if the purpose of our visual display is not for a reader to be able to identify specific numerical values? What about if the purpose of the visual display that we are creating is that our reader is able to see overall patterns and trends in the data? Have global temperatures increased or decreased in the past 1,000 years, right? Has at any point in the past, in the distant past, the average temperature of the world been higher than it is in the present, right? Those are general patterns and trends in the data that are very, very hard to spot through a numerical table. It's actually impossible to do so. It becomes much easier if we transform all these numbers, if we map those numbers in the form of visual displays of information, of data, right? Of data visualizations. Data sets similar to this one are behind some of the most influential and, in my opinion, some of the best graphics created in the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century. This is just a couple of them. One of them is called the hockey stick chart. This was actually the graphic that came out of this data set. That's a graphic that was created by a group of climate scientists in the late 90s. And it was made famous in 2001 when it appeared in the IPCC report of that year. And if you pay attention to it, you will see that it actually, in a very small space, it summarizes all the numbers that we had before. We have a blue line that shows us the point estimates, right? What the estimated temperature was, in the past, and you see that it goes up and down. You may notice that at some point that blue line becomes red, right? There's a difference between blue and red in this graphic. The difference is, and again, this is just an aside, but it's an important aside. We do have records of temperatures, right? Measured with thermometers, beginning in the 18th, 19th century. Very good data about that. That's the red line. The red line that you have on the first graphic here, that represents average temperature of the world measured through thermometers, right? But the blue line, what it represents is the estimates that scientists made about what the temperature was in the Middle Ages, obviously, or a little bit later, right? From the Middle Ages up to the present. Obviously, there were no thermometers around in the Middle Ages, and therefore we don't have records of temperature. So climate scientists need to reconstruct the temperatures, right? If you want to reconstruct the temperature in the distant past, you can take a look at the rings inside of trees, for example, and by the shape and the size of those rings, you can sort of estimate what the temperature was in the distant past. Well, that's the blue line. The blue line is the reconstructions, the average temperature of the world based on reconstructions. Then there's a black line, that's the smooth of the data. Let's call it a moving average of all the data. There's the gray area behind the numbers, that's the uncertainty of the data. And you can see there the uncertainty, it is much bigger in the past than it is in the present, because the closer we get to the present, the better the data we have, and so on and so forth. I don't want to get carried away. The point that I'm trying to make is that this graphic is useful if you want to spot individual values in the data. This other graphic is useful, on the other hand, if what you care about is not so much each specific value. We don't care that much about the specific numerical values there, the data points. We care more about the big picture of the data. Data visualization is more about this big picture of the data, displaying the patterns. And you see that there's a clear pattern here. There's a pattern of relative stability in the past. The temperatures go up and down, up, down, up, down, up, down. But once we get to the end of the 19th century, average global temperatures spike up very, very rapidly. And that's the exception to the pattern. Patterns and exceptions to the pattern. On the other side, there on the right-hand side, you have a more modern graphic. This is Ed Hawkins's warming stripes. Some of you may be familiar with this visualization. This was created in 2000, published, sorry. It was published in 2017, and it very quickly became a very iconic graphic. There is even an entire website that collects many variations of this visualization. It really went viral online. And it's a fantastic data visualization that displays the data in a completely different way. Rather than using a line chart, a traditional time series line graph, it uses a heat map in which the variation of the color is what is displaying the data. That graphic, by the way, I have showcased it in my latest book because it became so popular after it was published that it has appeared everywhere. It appeared in the cover of The Economist magazine. It is also on the cover of Greta Thunberg's climate book. There are people who have created clothing lines based on this graphic. People, take it to protests everywhere, right? And there's even the case of a person who lives in Michigan here in the United States who loved this graphic so much that decided to wrap up his car with the visualization. I actually talked to this person for my latest book. Now, this is a little bit overkill. I love data visualization, but I don't think that I would ever do that with my car. But this is just to show you that data visualization is a great way to present information to people, but it is also a great way, I believe, if it is well designed, to capture people's attention and people's imaginations, right, and bring people into the data. Now, these examples that I'm presenting to you, this interplay between tables and on the one hand tables and on the other hand data visualizations, it is also one of the first teachings that I give in my classes. When to use a table, when to use a data visualization. We should use a table when the goal is for a reader to be able to see individual values. Nothing beats a table by doing that. But when we want to present general stories, the big picture of the data, general patterns and trends, data visualization usually wins the day. Now, in some cases, many of you probably have faced this situation. You are designing a data visualization and you wonder, well, but besides designing this chart, should I also include every single value in the visualization? This is an example of that, right? This is an example that actually comes from Eurostat. As you can see, it's a series of bars. This is called a stacked bar graph, right? A stacked bar graph is essentially a graphic that shows you a total, a 100%, and then the portions of that total, right? You can see that the segments change in terms of the percentages that they correspond to, right? This is essentially an alternative to a pie chart, for example, right? So that's the type of chart. But notice something. Besides showing us the data, represented graphically, the graphic also includes every specific value. So whenever I see examples like these, I always challenge people, what is the value of including every single number in the graphic? Sometimes there is a reason for that, right? You may be designing a graphic and you may be thinking, well, I have two different types of audiences for this graphic. On the one hand, I think that my audience is made of people who want to see the big picture of the data, and the data visualization will serve that purpose. But I also know that, some of the managers that I'm going to be presenting this graphic to are very detail oriented, and they want to see every single specific value in the data graphic that I'm presenting to them. And that will be a good reason to include every single value in the graphic. However, the result of that is usually graphics that look very cluttered, very busy. And if you notice here, that is the case. The numbers that are placed inside of the bars, they look a little bit squished, don't they? Right? There's not enough margin in between the numbers and the boundary of the rectangles that contain those numbers. And the result of that is a graphic that looks a little bit cluttered, a little bit busy. So in cases like these, and this is a very practical recommendation from me to you, whenever you face this situation, it may be better to think about presenting first the graphic as not the graphic, the data as a visualization. And then if you need to present also the actual values behind the graphic, present them as a separate table. So people can either focus on the visualization or focus on the table, right? Some people would only read the graphic. Some people will only read the table. And you will be serving the needs of both audiences by doing it this way rather than cramming all the values here. It is preferable in cases like this, in my opinion, to design a table. Anyway, that was just an aside. Right now, if you notice, when I was presenting the hockey stick chart to you and the a warming stripes graphic, I refer to the type of graphic. And I said, we can present this data as a line graph, or we can present this data as a heat map that represents the graphic through the variation of shades of color. And that's a great segue to this part of the presentation, because that type of talk leads us for me to talk a little bit about what we call in visualization the grammar of graphics. And here's when I start getting into the nitty-gritty of data visualization, what data visualization is truly about. What underlies the creation of charts? What happens in a software tool, Excel, Tableau, Power BI, R, Python? There are many tools nowadays to create data visualization. What is it that the tool does when you ask it to create a data visualization? Well, it applies what we call in visualization the grammar of graphics. A couple of book recommendations related to this. There's actually a book titled The Grammar of Graphics that I happen to have here on the left-hand side of me, written by Leland Wilkinson. This is a classic in the data visualization literacy. It's highly technical, though, so I don't recommend it as an introductory book. As an introductory book, though, I would recommend Visualization Analysis and Design by my friend Tamara Mansner. That book, by the way, in my opinion, is the most important book about data visualization published in the last decade or so. It's a great summary of the language of data visualization. I'm giving you these book recommendations as context to what I'm about to explain to you related to the grammar of graphics, this grammar of graphics. So what is the grammar of graphics? The grammar of graphics is essentially a structured framework to think about how to encode data when we transform the data into charts. So let's get into that. The notion of encoding data has to do with the fact that data visualization at its core consists of connecting the data that we have on a spreadsheet or on a database, connecting it to objects that we usually call marks, right? And marks are usually geometric objects, although they don't need to be. They are usually geometric objects, but there are other types of objects that we can use in data visualization. So rectangles, circles, triangles. So we connect the data to these marks, to these objects. And then what we do is to vary, to modify certain attributes of those objects in relation to the data that we are representing. And these attributes that change according to the data, we call those attributes the visual channel or the encoding, right? The visual channel. So on the one hand, we have the marks. Those are the objects that we are going to use to represent the data. And then on the other hand, we have the visual channels, which are the attributes, the properties that we actively vary to represent the data that we're having. This is actually super simple to understand. Take a look at the bar graph, the first graphic that we have there. We begin with a bunch of rectangles. Well, those are squares, right? But a square is a type of rectangle. We begin with a bunch of rectangles. And then when we map the data, when we connect the data to those objects, then what the software tool does for us is to vary a property, an attribute of those rectangles in proportion to the data that we are creating. In this case, it will be the height of those rectangles will vary in connection to the data that we are trying to represent. We can also use position to represent data and many other attributes. We can change the color, right, of the objects in proportion or in relationship to the data. So for example, if we have a categorical a data set, right? Countries, for example, each one of those countries could be represented by a color. Red is Spain, orange is the Netherlands, blue is France, and so on and so forth. That will be a categorical variable. In data visualization, we can use a lot of different encodings. This is something that I get quite deeply into in my second book, The Truthful Art, in which I explain this grammar of graphics for a general public with much more depth. So in data visualization, we can use length, height, position Area, right? Many of you probably have seen bubble charts or bubble maps in which circles are used to represent data, right? The encoding, the visual channel there will be the area of those objects. Angle, for example, in pie charts and in donut charts, what is representing the data, the attribute that represents the data is the variation of the angles of the different segments of the pie chart. Line weight, you may have seen, for example, there's a type of graphic that I will show you later in these webinars called the Sankey diagram, right? Which is a graphic in which you begin with a total represented by a very thick line, and then the thick line splits up into branches, right? Into different branches, each one of them with a line weight proportional to the data being represented. For example, if you're trying to show the exports from a country to other countries, you may represent the data using that, the total of exports, and then how those exports, right, go to different countries, and the lines will be proportional to the proportion, to the percentage of exports to each one of those countries. And then color hue and color shade can also be used to represent data. There are many other ways of representing data in data visualization. Now, one of the reasons why I'm putting so much emphasis on this grammar of graphics is that internalizing this knowledge will lead you to become better thinkers about data visualization. Because an exercise that I'm going to ask you to do from this point on, from this class on, is that whenever you see a data visualization in the wild, in a newspaper, in social media, wherever you see it, don't just look at it and move on. Take a look at it and try to deconstruct it. Try to look at it and identify what are the visual channels, the marks and the visual channels being used in that data visualization. Stop for a second and analyze it, right? That will develop in you a sense of how this grammar of graphic applies to the real world, and you will be able to start applying this thinking to your own work. So let's do that exercise right now. Obviously, there is almost 2,000 people in the room right now, so I'm not going to ask you to answer this question. Just answer it to yourself, right? I show you that graphic as this is a pie chart. Well, it's a variation of a pie chart called a donut chart, but in essence, it's a pie chart. Take a look at it. This comes also from the European Union. It's a total, and then the portions of that total. What are the visual channels that you see here? Well, on the one hand, if I go back to the previous slide, you may see that they are using hue, different colors. The colors are used to identify the different categories. That's a categorical variable, right? The different parties being represented here. The greens, EPP, the left, and so on and so forth. So that hue is being used to identify that variable, right? The values corresponding to that variable. And then the data itself, which is essentially the proportions of this total, the portions of this total, is represented through angle, the angles of these objects, because essentially that's a pie chart. And the pie chart is a graphic that uses as the main visual channel the angle of those segments. Now, what about this one, right? This is a line graph, right? This line graph is the type of graphic, but it is not the type of visual channel, right? When we develop a sense of the grammar of graphics, we learn to talk and think about visualization, not only in terms of types of charts, pie chart, line graph, bar graph, scatter plot, and so on and so forth, but also in terms of this underlying grammar of graphics. So the type of graphic here is line graph. This is another great graphic by Eurostat. But what are the underlying visual channels, right? If we go back to this slide, what properties of those objects are changing according to the data? Take a look at this screen right now, just for 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And let me go to that slide again. The first one that you may notice is, again, color hue. Color hue is being used to represent the different categories, right? EU 27, non-EU 27, reporting country, right? 3 categories, 3 different colors, color hue. But what about the data itself? Those percentages, the years, because we have two quantitative variables here. We have the year and we have the percentage, right? I'm actually doing the graphic, giving you the answer using my hands, because the visual channel here, the visual channel that has been used to represent these numbers here is position, right? Whenever we ask a software tool to create, for example, a line graph, what the software tool usually does first is to create what we call in visualization the framework or the scaffolding of the graphics, right? The Cartesian coordinate system with an x-axis and a y-axis. And then what it does next is to position a little dot per observation over the horizontal axis, one dot per year, per unit of time, right? In this case, the unit of time here is years, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2020, 2021, 22, one dot per year. And the encoding, the visual channel here, is the position of those dots. And then what the software tool does is to vary, the attribute that varies is the position of those dots also on the vertical axis to actually represent the data, right? The percentages here. So the actual answer to my question, what visual channels are at work here, is position. At the end, a line graph is in essence like a scatter plot, right? It's a scatter plot. It's only that the dots that we create in the line graph are later connected with a line to facilitate, in the eyes of the reader, being able to spot the patterns and trends, the time series patterns and trends that may underline the data. Imagine this graphic without the lines connecting the dots, right? It will be hard to spot ups and downs. It is much easier if we connect the dots, okay? Anyway, these are the basics of the grammar of graphics. Now, some of you may be wondering, okay, but this is super interesting, but it's also highly theoretical, right? Let's cut to the chase here, right? Why you, Professor Cairo, don't you tell me, okay, but what are the rules, right? What are the rules of applying this grammar of graphics? How do I choose, right, between, using position, height, area, color, and so on and so forth to represent my data, right? Give me quick answers, right? This is something that I tend to hear quite a lot from my students at the beginning of every single semester. Many of them come to my classes thinking that I'm about to deliver, a knowledge that is written on stone. Here are the rules of data visualization. And I try to disabuse them from that notion. Again, I tend to equate data visualization and information design more broadly to writing. And I usually tell them, well, it's not that easy. It's not that easy because data visualization is similar to writing in many ways. First of all, is based on a vocabulary and a grammar, right? Both of them. The grammar of graphics. We use symbols, those are the marks, and then we use a grammar to essentially think about how to structure those symbols, how to modify those symbols so those symbols make sense. So in some sense, in a very real sense, data visualization is a language. But pretty much like writing, there are few rules that are set in stone in data visualization that can be easily memorized. It's not that easy, right? Like writing, data visualization consists more of developing a sense of a style, right? And that's what I'm going to try to instill in you in these three webinars, this framework of thinking about data visualization. And third of all, data visualization, as I anticipated before, can be used for many purposes. Not only the purposes that I use it for, communication and reasoning. Some people use data visualization, and we will return to these in the third webinar when I talk about creative visualization. Some people use visualization for artistic expression, the same way that we can use written language to write journalism or to write poetry, right? Those two things are completely different, but both of them are legitimate uses to writing, right? Or legitimate uses, in this case, of visualization. So how can we think about visualization, or how can we develop, how can we become good visualization designers if there are really not many rules that are set in stone? How can we develop a good way of thinking about visualization? The way that I explain it to people, and it's something that I outline in my latest book, The Art of Insight, is that visualization doesn't really consist of applying rules, right? Use a bar graph for this, use a line graph for that. It's not that easy, right? What visualization consists of is thinking about possible choices that you can make, that we should make, considering or weighing the interplay between the content, the nature of the data that you are encoding, that's going to affect everything, every single decision that we make in visualization. What is the nature of the information? The people, who your audience is, that should affect also your designs, because it is not the same thing to create a graphic for, let's say, statisticians or economists than to create the same graphic for the general public. It is not the same thing. It could be the same graphic, but it will need to be put in context in a completely different way. Right? So thinking about audience is extremely important. Intent. What is the purpose of this visualization? What is it that I'm trying to achieve, to accomplish? Remember that what I said before about visualization being a way for a tool that has a specific function. Constraints, right? What limitations we may face? What is the platform? What am I going to show this graphic? Is it going to be shown on a mobile screen? Is it going to be shown on a poster? Is it going to be shown on, I don't know, on a wall, right? That will be size. The size of the platform is a possible constraint. And also the outcomes, meaning that do people really understand what am I presenting to them? How is the graphic perceived or received? One thing that I try to instill in my students is that whenever we design a graphic, every single object or every single element, every single decision that we make about that graphic must be deliberate. That begins with the scale, with the baseline, where we put the baseline, what type of colors we use, where we put the title, where we put the footnote, where every single decision that we make must be deliberate, and it cannot be left for the computer software to make. That decision cannot be made by a computer. It needs to be made by a human being. That's how I educate my students. Every single choice must have a reason behind, and that reason should be something that you should be able to express. I made this choice because, and then you give the reasons for that particular choice, right? It's a very deliberate process. And every decision that we make in visualization, the following statement, this is just an aside, but it usually scares my engineering and data science students a little bit, because I tell them very openly, every decision that you make in visualization is subjective. And subjectivity is a word that scares some people out. But then I append the second half of the question. Every decision in visualization is subjective, but it should never be arbitrary. For every choice that you make in your graphic, there needs to be a reason for it. And that is what I'm going to outline for you between today and the next following days, how to make these specific choices. So let's begin with that. Let's begin by getting a little bit deeper into this decision-making framework that I tend to use in my own graphics. Let's begin with an example. Before I show you the example, by the way, I'm going to give you another reading recommendation, because the example comes from the people behind this publication. This publication is called The Pudding. The Pudding is an online magazine that publishes stories about sports, about culture, about music. But all of them, this is what makes The Pudding special, all the stories published in The Pudding are data-driven stories. It's one of my favorite sources for inspiration when it comes to data visualization, because the people behind The Pudding are not only excellent designers and excellent journalists, but also they're great innovators. They're always trying to use new technologies and explore them. So I really, really encourage you to bookmark The Pudding and visit it on a regular basis. And if you can, subscribe to it, okay? Because you can subscribe. All the content here is free, right? But I like to support the publications that I tend to follow. In any case, the designers behind The Pudding also run a company, and the company is called Polygraph, right? Polygraph is a design firm that I collaborate with. I have several ongoing projects with them, excellent designers, but they collaborate also with many other organizations. Years ago, Polygraph collaborated with an organization called the American Society of News Editors, right? Which is a nonprofit organization in the United States that every year conducts a survey about the composition of the newsrooms, of the newspapers and magazines in the United States. Composition in terms of the workforce, right? How many men, how many women, how many white people, how many African-American people do you have in your newsroom? And they report the results of this survey every year. Well, a few years ago, the American Society of News Editors collaborated with The Pudding to visualize their data. And that's one of their visualizations that they publish. Okay, I will get to it in just one second. But before we get to it, take a look at what I wrote on this particular slide. A great exercise to become a better designer and a better thinker about data visualization, as I said before, is to start paying close attention to the visualizations that we see every day. Not only thinking about the encodings, the visual channels behind that visualization, but also to try to reverse engineer that visualization. If I were the designer who is creating this particular graphic, what type of steps would I have taken to reach that particular solution or to reach that particular point? To try to guess what steps took to that particular graphic. We're about to do that together in just 1 minute. In any case, the graphic that you have on the screen right now shows the gender breakdown of American newsrooms. Each one of those dots, this is an interactive graphic, by the way. When you have access to the slides, you will be able to hover over each one of these bubbles. Each one of them represents a newspaper, an American newspaper. The size of the bubble represents the size of that newspaper in terms of the workforce, how many workers, how many journalists that organization has. And you may notice that each one of the bubbles is positioned on the horizontal axis according to a variable. And the variable is whether that newspaper has more men on staff. You see that to the left are newsrooms that have more men than women on staff. And then to the right, we have newspapers that have more women than men on staff. One very important caveat about this graphic, by the way, and one limitation about the data set for this year, this was in 2018, so a few years ago, is that the survey didn't include an option for non-binary or transgender people. That is something that they fixed in later editions of the survey. So in this edition, it was only binary, either men or women, okay? So that's a limitation of the data, obviously. But in any case, take a look at the graphic. What types of steps, right? If I were, let me do that exercise in front of you, right? If I need to think out loud about this graphic, right? What types of steps do I think that these designers follow to create this graphic? Let's get started with that, right? Probably that graphic originally began looking like the graphic that you have up there on the upper right corner, right? That is called in visualization a strip plot, okay? The strip plot is a graphic in which we represent each observation of a distribution as little symbols. They could be dots, or they could be stripes, they could be lines, right? And we put them on a single axis, right? The strip plot is one of the many ways in which we can represent distribution, right? A concentration, dispersion, the shape of a single variable. And you may be thinking, particularly those of you who have a background in quantitative sciences or statistics, well, there are many other ways to represent also concentration, dispersion, the shape of a variable, right? We could use density plots, we could use violin plots, we could use histograms to represent the data. The strip plot is just one of the many ways in which we can represent concentration or dispersion of a single variable. Now, the thinking here would be, this is the thinking that should happen in your brain, right? Why did these designers decided to use a strip plot in which each one of the observations is represented with a dot rather than a histogram? Well, I could think a good reason for that. Probably these designers were thinking, well, we are talking about individual newspapers, and we want to represent, to keep this individual nature of the data set, right? If we created a histogram instead, that will force us to bin the data, right? We will lose that individual nature of the observations. And as long as the data set is not very big, right? This is just 40 or 50 newspapers, we are allowed, right? We are able to represent each one of the observations as a little dot. On the other hand, try to imagine if the data set were much bigger. For example, if instead of having 40 or 50 newspapers, we had 5,000 newspapers, then the strip plot will not be a good idea, because all the bubbles, all the little dots will overlap so much with each other that the graphic will be completely impossible to read. And that gives us a good reason to use a histogram rather than a strip plot. Notice what I'm doing here. If then, if I want to do an individualized graphic, I use the strip plot. If the data set is too big, maybe I should use a histogram. That is not a rule. It's a decision-making process. Then the next step will be, well, if I take a look at this graphic, it looks very bare, right? It looks, let's add some color to it, right? Because if we add color to it, we not only make the graphic a little bit more visually attractive, right? we also make the graphic a little bit clearer because we are emphasizing the message, right? Blue versus red, men versus women. Now it is easier to see that there are many more newspapers on the left-hand side than to the right-hand side. But maybe this binary thing, maybe we can use a little bit of sort of like more granular sense to it. Maybe instead of just using color hue, we could also use color shade, right? Just to further represent, right, the gradual nature of the data, bluer and redder. Now, the graphic looks great right now. It looks very clear. I can see that most of the dots are to the left-hand side, meaning that most newspapers have more men than women on staff. But then notice that the designers of this piece did something else. They also varied the size, the area of those bubbles. What would be a good reason for that? Because there is a reason for that, if you think about it. Take a look at the current graphic, right? This third graphic that I have just designed. If I keep it this way, the graphic is clear enough, right? It's very clear. We have few newspapers here, many newspapers there. But at the same time, if I look at it, I said, well, but all these newspapers look the same. They all look like they are all the same size, right? They all look like they all have the same number of workers. And that is actually not true. If we don't represent the size of the workforces of each one of these newspapers, we are losing something that is intrinsic to the nature of the data that we are representing. That will be a decision, if you remember the list of things that we need to consider that I showed you before, it will be a decision related to the nature of the data. We need to represent the size of these newspapers because otherwise they all look the same. And they are not the same. Big newspapers tend to be to the left, more men than women. And the ones that are on the right, the ones that have more women than men on the staff, tend to be tiny newspapers. That's a key part of the story. If we don't represent that, we will not be telling the truth about the data. If we want to represent it accurately, we also need to change the size of the bubbles. However, notice what happens if we do this. They overlap too much, right? The bubbles are so close to each other that when we represent them, they obscure each other quite a lot. The graphic looks very cluttered. And therefore, again, the decision-making process. That leads us to think about a way to make the information clearer, rather than put all the bubbles on the same horizontal scale, which leads to obscurity, right? To the overlapping that doesn't allow us to see the individual nature of the data that we care so much about. Maybe we want to spread out the position of those graphics also on the vertical axis in order to make the graphic read a little bit more clearly, right? In this decision-making process in which we are thinking about the nature of the data, what we want to accomplish, what the goals of the graphic are, what the encodings and the visual channels are, we have moved from one type of graphic to another type of graphic. The first graphic is called a strip plot in the language of data visualization. The last graphic is called a bee swarm plot, right? We love cute names in data visualization, right? Like a bunch of bees flying around. In webinars to come, right, in webinar 2 and 3, we are going to go deeper into this decision-making process, and we are going to think about together about each one of these considerations in a more systematic way. This is a diagram that I will return to over and over again in webinars to come. But we can begin by talking a little bit about how important it is when we consider all these aspects, all these elements that make up a data visualization, how important it is to think about intent, what the goal of the graphic, what the goal of our graphic is. To talk about that, and I'm getting to the end of the presentation here, I would like to talk to you about the work of a researcher, Elsie Lee Robbins. So Robbins is a researcher who has done extensive work trying to connect the literature of data visualization with the literature about education, right? Education and pedagogy, right? In education, teachers, for example, when teachers in a school try to develop a lesson plan, they usually establish goals, right, for that lesson plan, right? My students will learn this particular thing or will be able to do this particular thing. And they list those in those lesson plans, they list those educational objectives, learning objectives, as bullet point lists. And what Elsie advocates for in data visualization, and I agree with her, is that it can take us a long way to think about visualization in this way as well. Whenever we're going to design a graphic, we need to think about, what is my intent? What is it that I want my readers to be able to learn about this particular data set? So I'm going to show you just an example in anticipation to what I will continue talking about tomorrow on webinar 2. Now, before I refer to this type of graphic, right? This is called a stacked bar graph, very similar to the one that I showed you before. This is actually based on a real world graphic in which I completely changed the data. It comes from one of my clients that I do consulting for every year. So this company has different warehouses. They sell tons of different products. Each one of these rows represents the products that each one of these warehouses sell, right? So of all the products that each one of those warehouses deliver, the 100% of products, what percentage correspond to each one of these products, right? So we have warehouse 1, a little bit of blue, a lot of yellow, a little bit of red, right? Adding up to all the sales from that warehouse. Well, there's nothing wrong with this graphic, a stack bar graph, but thinking about the quality of this graphic would require to think about what is it that we are trying to accomplish. Let's think about this graphic in terms of what Lee Robbins called learning objectives. What could lead us to this particular graphic? What type of thinking would lead us to this particular graphic? The way to verbalize it, in my opinion, will be this way. The reader will see that the data corresponding to each one of the warehouses adds up to 100%. That's the first learning objective. And it does accomplish that, right? We see that these are portions of a total. And then another possible learning objective that could lead us to this particular graphic is the reader will get a general impression of the portions of that total, meaning that we care more about the total than we care about the portions. Why do I say this? Because let's suppose that the learning objectives are different. Let's suppose that we don't care that much about the total. We care more about the portions. Let's suppose that your goal as a designer or as an analyst or as a data scientist, when designing this graphic, is not that a reader will get a sense that this is a total. But your goal with this graphic, the learning objective, is different. Let's suppose that your learning objective is that your reader will be able to compare product 1 to product 1, product 2 to product 2, product 3 to product 3, and product 4 to product 4, and so on and so forth. Now, it is easy to compare product 1 to product 1 throughout the warehouses because all the blue bars are sitting on a common vertical baseline. So you can immediately identify that it's warehouse 3, the one that is selling more of product 1. But what about if you want to compare product 5, which is the red portion? You will quickly find yourself squinting like I'm doing right now and using your fingers. I call this the finger measurement test. When you find yourself doing this with a graphic, it's probably because that is not the most adequate way to represent the data. Okay, so what is the biggest seller in terms of product 5? Okay, no, it's not warehouse 1, not warehouse 2. It's probably warehouse 4, but I'm not sure, right? It's hard to see. Meaning that if the learning objective of this graphic is to be able to compare product to product throughout the warehouses, this is not an adequate graphic. A graphic like this may be better to accomplish that goal. This is again to show you that it's all about this deliberate thinking process, right? That is a structure in a way. Every decision here that I'm making about how to display this data is highly subjective. It's very subjective. I'm just making an assessment about how to better represent this data, but it is not arbitrary. There are reasons for every single decision that I made about how to display this data, and it all can be based on this idea of thinking about visualization in terms of learning objectives. Now, to close the webinar today and move on to the Q&A, I would like to show you a real-world example of decision-making, a graphic that I designed myself a couple of years ago for a client. So this client is a law firm here in Miami that hires me every now and then to create charts that they can take to court and present to a jury. Okay, so we're going to do a little exercise here. Let's suppose that I am an attorney presenting the case to you, and that you are the jury for this case. You are going to be the biggest jury in history, right? More than 1,000 people, members of the jury. So first of all, I'm going to present the facts of the case to you in verbal form, and then I will present them to you in visual textual form with a visual and a text as well. And you are going to decide which one of them is more effective, right? So here are the facts of the case, members of the jury. So we have two companies here, my client, company A, and a company that we are suing called company B. Company A, my client, company B, the people we are suing. Now, why are we suing company B? Well, it turns out that company B is a provider of ours, okay? Beginning in January of 2017, company B manufacture components for machinery that we, company A, produce, right? So they provide certain pieces for the machinery that we produce. And for a while, very few of those components produced by company B were defective. We were very happy with the failure rate. It was only 0.5. Only 0.5 of these components were defective. Very, very happy with that. Really, really high quality components. However, between 2018 and early 2019, a much higher percentage of those components provided by company B started failing, right? Actually, this percentage increased so much that around 33% of these components, this is the peak of the failure rate, around 1/3 of these components were defective at that time. And that is not acceptable, because as a result of that, the machinery that my client, company A, produced, it also started failing. Our client, company A, I'm not going to tell you how, right? There's lots of evidence here. I'm just presenting you the general, topics of the case. We obtained some tentative evidence that suggested that at least since June of 2018, there was a defect in the equipment that company B was using to manufacture the components that they sold to us, right? We had that evidence. But company B said that there was no defect in their production equipment. They blame us. They blame client A, arguing, among other things, that it was us, right, company A, that was not assembling these components correctly. And as a result of that, the machines that we produce were not working. Well, I would say that that is not true. Why not? Because we also had some evidence, company A got some evidence, that without telling us, company B purchased new production equipment which was put in use in May of 2019. And you know what happened right after this new production equipment was put in place? The failure rate of the components produced by company B and sold to company A, the failure rate dropped again back to 0.5%. Are you sleeping already? Probably, right? Because this is a lot of things to swallow, right? This is the equivalent of presenting data just through a table. It's so much. Company A, company B, failure rate going up. Maybe, by the way, when I'm describing the case to you, in your brain, you are picturing a graphic already. When you find yourself doing that, that tells you that that's a great opportunity for a graphic. So I'm going to show you just one of the graphics that I created for this case. Actually, the main graphic, not the only one, but the main graphic. Imagine that instead of presenting the case to you this way, I pair the narrative with the gradual revealing of a chart, right? I begin by telling company A, company B, I show you the percentage of effective components. You see the scale there, very, very low at the very beginning, only 0.5. Then the failure rate increases up to its peak of 34.5% in February 2019. And then I also label the time when company B put the new production equipment in place. And what happened after? The failure rate came down again to 0.5. Now the case is clear, right? You see it, right? You may forget all the words that I have just told you, but the graphic is like, it's something that strikes you so much that it becomes memorable and also persuasive. And it's fully based on the data provided by company B, by the way, and we obtained by in company A, and all the evidence that we have obtained for the case. Now, the case was won, and the attorneys that presented the case in court said that this graphic and other graphics, obviously, that we produced for the case were key to winning the case. And the most common reaction among members of the jury when they saw this graphic was, oh, wow, right? Because you notice that, right? You notice that there is a pattern and the exception to the pattern that I presented to you at the very beginning. The pattern is very low failure rate and suddenly a high spike, and then go back to the pattern. Pattern and exception to the pattern. The question that I was asking myself, I know in conversation with these attorneys later, is would our side have been as persuasive as it was in court without the charts? Well, maybe yes, but certainly the case was greatly helped by the presentation of charts that reveal the reality of the data that we had at hand. Anyway, that's all for today. Again, beginning tomorrow, webinar 2, we will return to this table of elements that constitute a data visualization. If you want to join, again, remember that tomorrow's webinar is going to be at the same time. Right? There's a link to join there. And also, before I forget, this is also part of the housekeeping. There's going to be a series of extra readings for all of you that we are going to make available, both through the webinar's website and also through this same slide deck. If you click on that link, that will take you to my own personal Google Drive, in which I have curated a list of extra readings about data visualization, because my goal with these 3 webinars is to whet your appetite to keep learning, to keep reading, to keep practicing about data visualization. But obviously, in the 3 or 4 hours that we are going to spend together between today and the next couple of days, it is not enough to teach you everything that you need. It's only enough to give you the elementary principles of my own understanding of what data visualization is about. Thank you so much again for having me. I hope that it was not a lot of content. And now we open the floor for questions. Oh, thank you. This is by far the most impressive webinars I've ever attended. That's high praise. Thank you so much. All right, so let me jump to the Q&A document. Ooh, there's a lot of... So how do we want to do this? Imma, you're there? Do you want me to read questions out loud? Are you going to do that?
Yes, Alberto, feel free to read them and reply to them. Thank you so much.
Is the hockey, so there's a great question here. Is the hockey stick designed to make you think and the hockey is designed to make you feel? That's such a fantastic question. And you're getting to something that I was going to go back to in the next couple of days. That is true. I mean, the hockey stick chart and the warming stripes, they have completely different purposes. The hockey stick, as effective as both of them are, they are wonderful graphics. But the hockey stick graphic is more, let's say, analytical, statistical. It's all about representing the data accurately so you can see the patterns and trends, right? It's very impactful if you know how to read it, but it's a little bit nerdier. It takes you a while to get the message. Whereas the warming stripes is a punch in the face. It's like, that's the goal of that graphic. And I need to give you some background about Hawkins's warming stripes graphic, which I talk about in the Out of Insight, which I have over here. So when I interviewed Ed Hawkins for my latest book, I asked him specifically, why did you design this graphic? And he didn't design the warming stripes to be an analytical tool. He was going to attend a conference and he wanted to create an eye-catching image to put in the background while he was having a panel. And that's why he created that graphic as a very nice, very eye-catching picture that they could put in the background and then talk about the data. He said, well, this is an attention grabber. It's a way to start conversations. Oh, this is so interesting. What are all these stripes, right? What are all these colors? That's the reason why the graphic even doesn't even have a scale, right? It's just a way to start conversations. It's more about the impact, right? It's a great example, presenting those 2 graphics side by side to illustrate what I have just mentioned, right? Designing graphics is in part about the intent, what you want to. Sometimes the warming stripes is better. Sometimes the hockey stick chart is better. Sometimes the table is better. It all greatly depends on what we want to accomplish. So that's a fantastic question. There's a question about AI. What are the pros and cons of using AI on data visualization? So I've been experimenting with several Gen AI solutions to create data graphics, and I have been, sorry to say, utterly unimpressed. They make a lot of mistakes. Graphics look really ugly. They require a lot of tweaking or a lot of prompt rewriting. And at some point, when writing prompts, I find myself thinking, why should I waste so much time writing prompts when I can simply design the graphic myself? What I have been thinking, though, is that generative AI is going to be, or is currently, is at least for me, extremely useful to write code, right? So if you want to write repetitive code, Gen AI is fantastic for that. If you know what you are doing, right? If you later, after the code is generated for you, if you can go by line and actually read it and double check and verify that everything is right. To me, Gen AI is sort of like a godsend, because even if I write a little bit of code, not a lot, but I write a little bit of the R programming language. I don't like to write code, so I like to use natural language to generate my graphics, right? So it's been a godsend in that sense, but I don't use it that often, and it needs to be used with great care. Fantastic care. Um, I usually get this question: what is my favorite software to create visualizations? There's no favorite software, and every software has its strengths and its weaknesses. I can talk a little bit in my own workflow, though, which is part of the question also. It greatly depends on what type of graphic I'm creating. So for static graphics, charts that are not going to be interactive, I usually first generate my charts using a programming language, which can be R, which is the programming language that I use, the letter R. But then I export whatever it is that R generate. I use R and then a library called ggplot, ggplot2. ggplot stands for grammar of graphics. For those of you who use ggplot, just be aware that it corresponds to the grammar of graphics, ggplot2. So I generate my graphics or it could be graphs, it could be maps in R and ggplot. Then I export them as PDFs, as vector PDFs, and then I bring them into a graphic design tool called Adobe Illustrator, and I give them the style in Adobe Illustrator. I improve the style in Adobe Illustrator. This is the workflow that I usually teach my students to follow in my classes. So I make all my compositions in Adobe Illustrator or in an open source alternative to Adobe Illustrator called Inkscape. Inkscape, that's Illustrator open source. But if it is an interactive graphic, I tend to collaborate with programmers and coders who are proficient at using JavaScript, which is the programming language for the web, to add interaction to those graphics. And I will show examples of these in webinars to come. But in that case, I don't make the graphics myself. I may make the visual mockups. This is what the graphics should look like. This is what this button should do. This is what this map should do, whatever. And then I pass that on to actual web developers, web programmers who can add the interactivity to those graphics, generating them directly in JavaScript. But there are there's so many tools nowadays, right? There's a couple of great tools to generate interactive graphics very easily. One of them is called data.europa, like wrapping up data.europa. You should look that up. There is another one called Flourish, like in flourishing. Those are two great tools to generate interactive graphics pretty easily. There's obviously the classic commercial tools, Tableau and Power BI. In terms of programming languages, I tend to use R, but I have many students who prefer to use Python. But go for it. If that is what suits you, great, just do it, right? So that's what, yeah, there's a question about linking to the resources folder. I'm going to try to do that right away, but the link is in the slides. And then I'm going to keep reading questions. I'm not in a rush to leave, by the way. I can stay a little bit longer and answer as many questions as possible. Let me see if I can copy and paste this link. Copy. So this is the resources folder. Observable is another tool also. Observable, it has just been mentioned in the chat window. Yes, Observable is another great one. So there's so many options. Like, just when I give advice to beginners, I usually tell them, don't obsess over tools, right? Just choose one or two tools, go for them, learn them really well, try to find what their limits are. And when you find their limits, then you can move on to another tool, right? There are also great tools to generate maps, right? For example, GIS, Geographic Information System tools. There is the classical commercial ArcGIS, but there's also the open source tool Quantum QGIS. So many options these days. It's a wonderful environment to be in, because at the beginning of my career, 30 years ago, there were not so many options. Canva, another question asked also about Canva. Yeah, so how can we avoid misleading graphics? Well, that's the webinar tomorrow, and there's no easy answer to that question. I will try to provide some tentative answers, again, following up with the thinking framework that I anticipated today, that can also lead us to create graphics that are a little bit less misleading, right? But that's the webinar tomorrow. How do you take into account the people that are colorblind or people who have other types of vision deficiencies? Excellent question. That is related to accessibility. In the resources folder, there is a specific folder about accessibility, and I will refer to accessibility ideas tomorrow, and also on webinar 3. I'm not an expert in accessibility, but I'm going to give you several basic tips and then refer you to the extra readings who are written by experts in accessibility in data visualization. So obviously, the basics are: don't use red and green color palettes, which is something that I have done myself. And tomorrow I will show you an example, right? Color palettes that are not colorblind safe. Increase the size of your fonts, because as we get older, right, it gets harder to read things on the screen. I'm getting older, like all of you, right? And today, sometimes graphics that my students design, all my students are obviously younger than I am, they tend to use tiny fonts and low contrast fonts. And I find myself reading their projects like these, right? I cannot read these, right? That's also related to accessibility, right? In any case, we will return to it in webinars to come. There are some other questions about the visualization tools. There's a question also about the Open Visualization Academy. So the Open Visualization Academy is a project that I'm working on at the moment. I'm going to link it through the chat window. This is not out yet. There's just an announcement. The Open Visualization Academy is essentially my most ambitious project to date. Much more than the books that I have written, much more than all the classes that I have taught. The Open Visualization Academy is going to be essentially like Khan Academy for mathematics, but for visualization and information design. It's going to be a series of courses, many, many different courses, all related to information design and data visualization, beginning with a core course. Yeah, it will be completely free. All the content there will be completely free. A core course which will be similar to this one, but much longer than this one, with much more content that I will teach. A massive open online course that I will also teach. And then tons of courses about specific issues related to data visualization. For example, accessibility. There's a whole course that has been recorded already and is truly excellent about accessibility in data visualization. Another one about ethics. Another one about feminism and inequalities in data visualization. Another one about dashboards, designing dashboards. Another one about cartography. And all of them, each one of these courses has been created by an expert in each one of these fields. There is a newsletter, yes, it is linked from the website. So the newsletter for the Open Visualization Academy, that's the newsletter, so you can sign up for it, because that's where I'm sending updates about the Academy. And again, all the content of the Visualization Academy is going to be free in perpetuity, and I will keep updating it, because that's my most ambitious project. I'm using my own personal funding. I have my own funding as a night chair at the University of Miami. I'm using my money, my professional money, so to speak, to pay for this initiative and to keep the library of content constantly growing in years to come. Certificates, yeah, there will be certificates given. So if you complete a course, you will get a PDF with a certificate, and so on and so forth. What has been the most challenging visualization you have done? That's a difficult one. I would say that, so if you go to the slide deck at the very beginning, when you visit the slide deck, one of the first slides shows graphics that I designed decades ago. And there's a screenshot of the graphic that I created with my team at El Mundo about the terrorist attacks in Madrid in 2004. In March of 2004, there was a terrorist attack in Madrid. Several trains were bombed by terrorists, and a lot of people died. More than 100 people died. And my team and I created visualizations, reconstructing the attacks, creating maps showing where the attacks happened, and so on. And emotionally, I would say that that was the most difficult graphic that I have ever worked on, for emotional reasons. What would you have liked to know when you started your career in data visualization? That's such a great question. How important it is to not think just about data visualization, but to expand your horizons. Now, if you look at behind me, you will see that there are tons of games, right? I love tabletop games. And I can tell you that being a fan of tabletop games throughout the years, since I was a little kid, has taught me a lot about information design, because tabletop game design is all about information design. Much of what I know about cartography, about thinking about numbers, thinking about systems, thinking about probability, because obviously when you play games, you roll dice and you need to think about probability, has been related to learning about games, theory of games, and also playing games. Connecting data visualization and information design to philosophy. Philosophy is another passion of mine. You can see there are some books back there. Those are philosophy books that I'm engaging with at the moment. So meaning what I'm trying to get at is, don't keep your attention focused only on the craft. Expand your horizons, and eventually you will be able to connect teachings from other disciplines to data visualization and to information design. Obviously, read about information design, but try to expand your horizons. In my case, it was probably, for example, cartography. One of the reasons why I ended up working in data visualization was that at some point in my career, I said to myself, the maps that I'm making, they are not that great. So let me learn a little bit about cartography. So I got myself an entire library of books about data cartography, and I fell in love with that stuff. I fell into a reading rabbit hole about cartography. I read like 20, 30 books about cartography, and that led to data visualization and also to data science eventually, because I don't have formal training in statistics or data analysis or data science. All that I know is just by reading and by connecting those readings and by follow up with those readings. So cartography led to data science led to statistics led to also to data visualization. There was a recommendation of Understanding Comics. That's a fantastic book, a fantastic recommendation. There's a question about Catan. I don't have Catan here, but I have it in my other game library. Catan is a famous German tabletop game. There's a question, will you provide an overview of the types of visualizations available? Yes, that will be tomorrow. Tomorrow I will show you a couple of resources. I don't have the time to cover every single type of graphic, every single type of chart, because that will take 3 or 4 webinars to teach you when to use a bar graph, when to use a line graph, when to use a scatter plot. But I will refer to the main ones, and then I'm going to give you tomorrow a couple of resources that can sort of like show you when and where to use them. Okay, that is related to the second webinar tomorrow, in which I will show you how to make choices in terms of when to use each type of a visual channel that I mentioned today. In your opinion, how to balance between quick report or a more elaborated one? Well, I usually approach, this may be related to the storytelling and narrative part of these webinars, which will be part 3. That will be webinar 3. I will teach you a couple of techniques that I use to layer and sequence information. I will go deeply into this on webinar 3. The techniques, which are not very complicated, that I usually follow to structure my own data narratives, is related to that, right? So the way to balance it is to always think that the quick report is your opening, what we call in journalism the lead of the story, or the lead of the story, right? The beginning of the story. What in a nutshell, what this story is about, what are the main takeaways, and you lead with that. And then later you can provide more depth and more depth and more depth in a sequential, but also on a layered fashion. Again, I will go over this on webinar 3. There's a question. Let me read this question because it's relatively long. I understand there has to be a balance between intention, technique, and tool. What could you do if you cannot find a tool that helps you to show the intention or idea you have for showing the data? Oh, this is such a great question because it has to do with the limitations of the tool. Sometimes, actually quite often, the defaults of software tools are not ideal in terms of color palettes, in terms of choices related to scales, and so on and so forth. What I have learned to do is to essentially overcome those limitations by essentially hacking the tools that I use, forcing the tools to do what I want to do, not what the tool tells me to do or asks me to do. In webinars to come, I believe that in webinar 3, I will also give you a couple of reading recommendations about specific software tools. So for example, I'm guessing that most of you use Excel, and Excel is a perfectly fine tool. But when it comes to data visualization, the default options of Excel, in my opinion, are not ideal, but there are ways to overcome them and to actually make Excel do what you want to do, not what Excel wants you to do. And there are a couple of resources that I will share with you on webinar 3 about that. Same with Tableau, same with R. As I mentioned before, it's like my own workflow. I love R, the R programming language. I love ggplot2 and the entire tidyverse, which is a set of libraries ggplot belongs to. But I am really not in love with the style of ggplot2, aesthetically speaking. So that's a limitation. So what do I do? Do I spend a lot of time coding, writing lines of code to change the style? No, it is much easier for me to just simply create the fantastic graphic in ggplot, whose style I'm not really in love with, and then bring it into a different tool and then style it into another tool. So sometimes the way to overcome that type of limitation is to expand our library of tools slightly and actually connect one tool to the other. Whatever you cannot do with one tool, then you do it with the others. There's a question, do you sketch your ideas out pen and paper? It greatly depends. Sometimes I sketch things out in the computer. It greatly depends on whether the graphic is very data heavy, in which case I sketch things out in the computer using tools like either Tableau or R or Flourish or data.europa. But if the graphic doesn't have a lot of content, or if I am creating a graphic that is a little bit more creative, a little bit more artistic, a little bit more unique, then I may sketch things out, pen and paper. Let's see what else we have here. Any tips for someone doing a career shift from data analytics to visual analytics? Yes, there are some people who have done that career shift. For example, my friend Nadie Bremer, I'm going to write her name, Nadie Bremer, in the chat window. You can Google her up, Nadie. So Nadie is a Dutch visualization designer with a background in astronomy, who began her career as a data analyst. And she made this shift between pure data analysis and data visualization. And today she's an extremely successful data visualization designer. So look her up in Google, try to find interviews with her. There's an interview with her, by the way, in The Art of Insight, in my latest book, in which she talks a little bit about this transition. So my latest book talks a little bit about that. But there's not an easy answer to that. It's like you just get started. So the way that everybody who makes that type of transition between another career and data visualization is to keep the job that pays the bills, right? Just keep doing it, and then use some of your spare time developing projects that you can put online and improving your skills, and then promoting that work, that side work online, to get the attention of people who may eventually hire you as a freelancer to create that type of work, and that may help you make that transition. That's how Nadie began her career. I know other many people. I can think about also my friend Shirley Wu, who is also a data visualization designer. People usually begin like that, by having visualization and information design as a side career. There's a question about ggplot. Did you write your own themes for ggplot2? It seems useful to me. Sure. I mean, I'm not an advanced coder. I'm a very basic coder. And as I said before, I don't like to code. So for me, it is easier to generate a simple graphic in ggplot2, not even care about the theme at all, and then bring it into a design tool and actually style it into a design tool. Now, that workflow, by the way, works for me, because most of the graphics that I produce are graphics that are going to be published, and that's it. They don't need to be reproducible, right? They just need to be published, but not necessarily reproducible. If I had to create a graphic that is fully reproducible by other professionals and by other scientists, then I would certainly do what you suggest, which is to create all the style within the programming language, in this case, R and ggplot2. Generate everything there and just provide the code. But that is usually not the case of the type of work that I do. Okay, every tool, every workflow is well suited for one purpose, but not so much for another. As a psychologist with no formal data visualization training, how can one start? Well, that's a great question. I don't have formal training in data visualization either. I am a journalist. I don't have formal training on anything. I am self-taught on absolutely everything that I teach, on absolutely everything that I do. How do you get started? Well, 3 or 4 different things. Get yourself a few introduction to data visualization books. Tamara Mansner's, I will mention a few of them. I mentioned a few of them today. I will mention more tomorrow, just a couple of them, right? Don't necessarily need to be my books. Tamara's book is excellent. There are other great books. Storytelling with Data by Cole Nussbaumer is another intro. I will mention a few of them in webinars to come. So get yourself 2 or 3 of those books, read them, and actually, take notes, etc. So reading is one of them, one of the first steps. Learning the principles, right? Or the way that visualization designers think. Choose a tool or two. Get started. It could be a programming language. It could be an off-the-shelf tool like Tableau or data.europa or what, and just get started. Just start producing graphics about topics that you care about. And then another thing that I would do will be to try to join a professional group to which you can show your work in progress and get feedback. And a great place to do that will be the Data Visualization Society. Any of you who's interested in data visualization, I think that it will be a great idea for you to join the society, DVS, the Data Visualization Society. They have a publication called Nightingale. They have very active discussion forums in which people share tips and tricks and recommendations, etc. People also share their work in progress to get feedback from the community. So it's just that interplay between studying, practicing, feedback, going back to the drawing board and practice more, and then make your work visible, either through places like the Data Visualization Society or actually publicly through social media to get feedback in general from the community. Do you fear that artificial intelligence will sometime replace visual designers? Well, there are 2 sides to that question. Certain companies, particularly companies that are completely clueless about what data visualization or data design or design in general are about, may decide to substitute, use generative AI instead of actual designers. That's up to them. But then the results of that work is going to be mediocre and is going to be wrong in many cases. Up to them if they want to do that. Now, more philosophically speaking, can generative AI substitute an actual human being making decisions? Absolutely not. Period. Absolutely not. Based on what I have seen so far, right? And I'm willing to bet that I'm not wrong in this and saying that it's not going to happen. Philosophically speaking, right? Professionally and pragmatically speaking, that may happen. Because again, in the eyes of many companies, is that why should I hire a designer when I have this tool over here that I can do all the work for me? What generative AI can do, though, is to speed up the process of creating graphics, to speed up the process of writing code, to speed up the process of making choices. And that's wonderful. That's fantastic, right? Like any other tool, it's an extension of our cognition, but there needs to be an actual cognition that makes those choices behind. And that's where the human being comes in. Do you consider yourself a scientist or an artist? I honestly don't know. I am a communicator. I am someone who likes to get ideas that I believe that may be beneficial to other people and to a community. I like to present those ideas in a way that I think people will understand, and then putting those ideas in the hands of other people. I use science to inform those decisions. And actually tomorrow I will talk a little bit about, I talk a little bit about the science behind visualization today. When I talk about Elsie Robbins's work on learning objectives in visualization, those are scientific papers, right? She actually did experiments with that. So there's some science in there. Tomorrow I will refer to more science when I talk about how to make choices between different types of graphics that can also be informed by science. But I consider myself more a disseminator, a promoter of visualization, a popularizer of visualization and data science in general, an educator in the broadest sense of the word. Am I an artist? I honestly don't know, right? That's a high calling, I would say, to call yourself an artist. Um, do you see real value in recreating data visualizations we find inspiring and interesting? Yes, absolutely yes. Whenever you see a graphic that you like or that you don't like, right, for some reason, try to recreate it, right? Try to establish a conversation with the graphic in the same way that, as you mentioned in your question, we did today with the gender parity graphic in newspapers in the United States. That process of reverse engineering a graphic is highly educational. It takes a lot of time. At the very beginning, at the very start, you need to do it very deliberately, right? It takes time and effort for you to follow that, but eventually it becomes second nature to you, right? It becomes like riding a bicycle. Riding a bicycle at the very beginning requires a lot of attention to where to put the handles and direct the wheel and whatever, but eventually that knowledge becomes tacit knowledge, right? It incorporates itself to your brain and you do it automatically, right? You almost can do that reverse engineering process almost tacitly and quickly. And so yes, and the process of doing that sometimes involve recreating graphics. I see that all the time. I do that all the time, even with my clients. Whenever I teach data visualization in companies or for international organizations like European Union, the World Bank, and many others, I ask my clients to send me examples of their work. Send me your work, and I will gently critique it. Right? I'm very constructive with my critiques, always try to be very kind with my critiques, and I will recreate it for you. You created these. This is what I would do instead. And I will recreate the graphic and then put the two graphics side by side. So together we can weigh the relative advantages or disadvantages of each one of these solutions. That's also part of that process. It's highly educational and it will enrich your experience as a designer. Well, I think that that's all for today. I hope that it was useful. Again, thank you so much for being here. I hope that most of you, even not all of you, will sign up for the webinar tomorrow because it's going to be a direct follow-up to what you saw today. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening in your case if you're in Europe, a nice afternoon if you're in the United States, or a nice morning if you're in Asia, I would guess. Thank you.